Welcome back, everyone. In this segment, we're going to talk about the origins of resilient science, particularly in the study of children. We'll talk briefly about the influence of World War II, about some of the pioneers who generated the early science on resilience, and then we'll talk about 4 waves in resilient science. World War II had a devastating effect on children around the world. Many children were killed, injured, experienced starvation, the trauma of bombing, and many other awful experiences. Many children were orphaned by the death rate in World War II. And people around the world began to realize what a terrible effect war had on children and became very concerned about that. As a result, UNICEF was founded in the aftermath of the war. That's the United Nations Emergency Fund for Children, and they did what they could to try to help children recover from the aftermath of the war. Also, there were scientists and clinicians who began to study the effects or observe the effects of war on children. 2 in particular were Anna Freud and her colleague Dorothy Burlingham, who published a book on children in war in 1943 that described their observations. They ran some of the war nurseries for children affected by the war in Great Britain. It was difficult to do research during World War II. That's always true in war and disaster. It's just difficult in that kind of situation to carry out high-quality studies. But people did try to gather data to try to understand what was happening to children and to try to help them. And there were some striking lessons from those early observations during and after the war. First of all, they realized the profound impact of separation and loss on children, that children reacted with great trauma to being separated from their parents. For example, during the Blitz, the bombing in Great Britain in World War II, many children, like the children pictured here, were evacuated either into the countryside to safer locations away from London and other cities that were being bombed, or they were even evacuated across the ocean. And this little group of children looks happy, but many of the children who were evacuated struggled because of the separation from their families. And the researchers and clinicians observed that separation sometimes could be more difficult than the trauma of the war experiences themselves. They also observed that children did react to trauma. They showed symptoms of shock and stress when they observed them in very dangerous situations. And yet they could also observe that if children were in the presence of the caregiver, usually a mother, then they would observe very little of those kinds of reactions. So already people were beginning to realize the tremendous protective role of proximity to the attachment figures in a child's life. World War II also had a profound effect on these 3 individuals who would come to play a crucial role in the emergence of developmental science and resilience. Norman Garmezy here was a young soldier in World War II, and he fought in the infantry. He took part in the Battle of the Bulge, for example. And after his years in the war, he went back home to the United States and became a clinical psychologist and eventually a very influential researcher and teacher who began to study children at risk and then turned his attention to resilience. He was my mentor and the mentor of many other students who became resilient scientists after him. Emmy Werner, shown here in the middle, was one of the young children in Europe who was profoundly affected due to the bombing and the starvation that many children experienced in Europe during and after the war. And she also experienced the help of humanitarian agencies like UNICEF and others who reached out to try to save these children. Emmy Werner would grow up to become the leader of one of the most important studies in resilience, a landmark study on the children of Kauai, which we're going to talk about very soon in this class. Michael Rudder from Great Britain was one of the children in World War II who was evacuated, in his case evacuated across the ocean to America, where he stayed with a family during the war for safety. And he would grow up to become the world's leading child psychiatrist and one of the most influential pioneers in the study of resilience. He did many important studies, but one of his memorable studies was to follow the children adopted from orphanages in Romania to try to understand how they recover in the aftermath of that kind of neglect and trauma. These three pioneers all began to study risk initially. They were interested in the origins of mental illness or health problems, and they studied children at risk to try to understand how mental illness and other kinds of problems develop. But what all three quickly realized in their research was that there was tremendous variation in the way children responded to great trauma and adversity. And they had this important insight that we were spending all of our time studying risk and problems, and that we had neglected the study of children who do well and recover well, that we needed to understand the processes that lead to positive outcomes and recovery in order to help other children who were not recovering as well. So they emphasized to a whole generation of other scientists that studying risk is not enough. And they gave a lot of energy to the theme of studying resilience in children who face adversity. Well, after the pioneers, those three and many others, got things underway, there have been 4 waves of resilience science. The first wave, like often the case in the early stages of any science, was focused on description. That people tried to figure out who is resilient, how do we measure that, what makes a difference, what are the protective factors that appear to account for how some children do so well when others don't. As people began to get a sense of what those factors were, they turned their attention to processes. How do these protective factors work? Because if you're going to intervene, you need to know how they work to try to understand more deeply how to promote resilience in other children. When investigators felt they had some good ideas about protective processes, they began to do intervention experiments to try to demonstrate that you could indeed promote resilience, and that would also confirm your theories about what makes a difference. And we're currently in the 4th wave. The 4th wave is kind of a tsunami in resilience science because it's such a large, complicated wave. It reflects the expansion of resilience science across multiple levels of analysis, made possible by important advances in technology and methods for analyzing resilience at different levels, from a genetic level to a brain level to a social interaction level to much higher levels in systems like community resilience, global resilience, and so forth. And the effort now is to try to understand resilience across different levels. How do different systems contribute to the resilience, for example, of an individual child? And we're going to be looking at research from all these different waves over the course.